Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're going deep on global trade imbalances.
Oh, yeah.
We've got uh, excerpts from Michael Pettis' book, The Great Rebalancing.
Okay.
And honestly, this book, it really kind of connects the dots between
Yeah.
like all these different economic events
Right.
in a way that I had never thought of it like that before.
Yeah, it's interesting because trade imbalances, I think a lot of times people just kind of boil it down to like currency manipulation,
Right.
unfair trade practices. But
Exactly.
Pettis, he really digs deeper and he shows like how the picture is actually way more complex.
Yeah, so it's not just like
Yeah.
countries trying to, kind of game the system or something.
Right.
There's deeper forces at play here.
Yeah.
And Pettis starts by
Yeah.
connecting these imbalances to something we all remember,
Yeah.
that 2008 financial crisis,
Yeah.
that whole thing that shook the world.
Mm-hmm.
He makes a really compelling argument
Yeah.
that the massive trade surpluses and deficits we saw
Exactly.
in the years leading up to the crisis
Yeah.
were a key part in the meltdown.
Uh-huh.
Like these imbalances were building up all this pressure.
Yeah. That's a
Something had to give.
good analogy. It's
Yeah.
like a yeah. It's like a pressure cooker almost.
So let's unpack this a little bit.
Yeah.
Chapter 2 dives into the nitty-gritty
Yeah.
of how things like tariffs and currency devaluation actually affect trade.
Yeah.
I'll admit, I went into this thinking I had a decent grasp on it.
Sure.
But Pettis, he really challenged my assumptions here.
It's not just about the prices changing, right? Which I think is
Yeah.
what a lot of people focus on, but the real impact is
Yeah.
how these interventions shift resources within a country,
Yeah.
especially impacting those savings and investment rates.
Okay.
It's like a ripple effect
Yeah.
that goes way beyond just that initial price change.
So it's not as simple as saying, let's put a tariff on these cheap widgets from Fredonia.
To protect domestic jobs.
Yeah. He uses this great example of
Yeah.
Fredonia
Okay.
imposing a tariff on widgets.
Uh-huh.
And the surprising thing is that the tariff
Yeah.
reduces the trade deficit not by reducing the number of imported widgets,
Oh, interesting.
but by reducing household income.
So wait, so even though they're still importing the same number of widgets,
Yes.
their trade deficit goes down.
It seems counterintuitive, but think about it this way.
Yeah, how does that work?
By reducing real household income, the tariff
Okay.
forces the national savings rate to go up.
Oh, okay.
And that, in turn, automatically reduces the trade deficit.
So tariffs might not always protect domestic jobs, but they can indirectly shrink the trade deficit
Exactly.
by their impact on household income.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big takeaway. Now, in Chapter 3, Pettis
Yeah.
really blows my mind here
Sure.
by revealing this whole universe
Yeah.
of policies that can indirectly impact trade balances.
Yeah.
I mean, who knew that things like environmental regulation
Yes.
or a booming stock market could be tied to trade?
It's amazing, right?
Yeah.
For example, he explains how
Yeah.
lax environmental standards can actually act as a hidden subsidy for producers.
Oh, interesting.
And he uses the example of Indonesian
Okay.
paint manufacturers.
Ugh.
By dumping waste, they lower their costs.
So they're essentially getting a competitive edge by polluting.
Exactly. But here's the catch.
Yeah.
Indonesian households then have to save more
Right.
for potential health issues
Yeah.
caused by that pollution, right?
Ah, wow.
So it's like this double whammy, right? It's
Yeah.
boosting their trade surplus,
Wow.
but also making the population poorer.
Talk about unintended consequences.
Exactly.
And then there's the whole thing about booming asset markets.
Right. So think about it when stock and housing markets are soaring,
Yeah.
people feel wealthier,
Right.
and so they consume more and they save less.
Right. Okay.
And this can lead to larger trade deficits.
Oh, so it's like a psychological effect
Yeah, almost.
that ripples through the economy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And what about lagging wage growth?
Yeah,
I've heard that can play a role too.
absolutely. When wages grow slower than productivity, it's like an invisible transfer of wealth
Yeah.
from workers to employers.
Okay.
And this can make exports more competitive and lead to larger trade surpluses.
It's fascinating how these seemingly unrelated things, like from pollution
Yeah,
to stock prices to wages, can all be connected
it's all connected, yeah.
to global trade imbalances.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this concept Pettis calls financial repression. So imagine this, like your savings account
Yeah.
barely earns any interest.
Right.
But businesses, they get loans at super low rates.
Yeah, that's financial repression in action.
Okay.
And it's common in a lot of developing countries.
So how does that tie back into trade?
Well, by suppressing the interest rates for depositors,
Right.
it essentially subsidizes borrowers, right?
Okay.
Leading to a surge in savings
Right.
and bigger trade surpluses.
Got it.
Pettis even shares this anecdote about a Chinese student
Yeah.
whose aunt had to save more because her savings account was
Yeah.
burning next to nothing.
It really hits home how these policies that might seem totally unrelated to trade have such a profound impact on these global
It's a really interconnected system, that's for sure.
economic flows.
Ah,
Now, speaking of China,
yeah.
Pettis dedicates an entire chapter to their growth model.
Yeah, so Chapter 4 is a deep dive into
Okay.
how China's policies have created those massive trade imbalances we've been talking about.
Right.
That undervalued currency,
Yeah.
financial repression, lagging wage growth.
Right.
We just talked about all those things.
Yeah.
They all play a key role.
It's interesting how he points out that China's incredibly low consumption rate
Right.
and their sky-high savings rate
Yeah.
are like direct results of these policies.
Yeah.
And he throws in this fascinating historical tidbit
Uh-huh.
about Confucian values.
Oh, yeah. Remember how for a while
Right.
Confucian values were blamed
Right.
for Asian poverty?
Totally.
Yeah.
Well, now
And now they're praised.
they're praised for driving economic success.
Right.
It really shows how these explanations can shift so dramatically.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what other assumptions
Yeah.
we're making that might be off base.
Exactly.
Now, Pettis also talks about this concept of backwardness,
Yeah.
where countries in the early stages
Yeah.
of development can actually benefit from suppressing consumption
It's an interesting idea.
to boost investment and drive rapid growth.
From economist Alexander Gershenkrone.
Okay.
And it has its merits, but
Yeah.
Pettis emphasizes that it eventually hits a wall. Right.
You know, as debt-fueled investment
Okay.
becomes unsustainable,
Yeah.
those high growth rates, they start to fade.
So are we saying China's economic model is doomed?
Well, not necessarily, but
Yeah.
you know what we're seeing is that those imbalances
Right.
can't go on forever. Something's got to give,
Yeah.
and that's where things get really interesting.
Right.
In the next part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
we'll explore
Okay.
what the consequences are of these imbalances
Right.
and how they kind of ripple outwards, impacting that entire global economy.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm fascinated to hear it.
Okay.
Okay, so we've said that trade imbalances are like more than just some countries like playing unfairly or whatever.
Yeah.
But what happens when one country's policies like actually start messing up the global economic playing field? Like,
Right.
is it really that interconnected?
Oh, it is. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's like this chain reaction, you know, and it's hard to like really predict what's going to happen, you know, but Pettis says that these distortions don't just impact the country that creates them, right?
Right.
They can force other countries to make adjustments, sometimes in like really unexpected ways.
Okay, give me an example.
Yeah.
How can one country's policies have that much impact on everyone else?
Yeah, he uses this really interesting example.
Okay.
European subsidies for Airbus.
Okay.
Right. On the surface, you might think, okay,
Yeah.
so Europe's making airplanes, the U.S. is making airplanes.
Right.
What's the big deal?
Yeah.
But Pettis shows how these subsidies can actually end up hurting
Okay.
American airplane manufacturers, like Boeing, for example.
Right.
And get this, it can even lead to a lower savings rate in the U.S.
Hold on, I'm not following.
Yeah.
How do subsidies for Airbus in Europe
Right.
translate to Americans saving less? Like,
Okay.
they're not even the same products,
Wait,
right?
so think about it this way, okay?
Okay.
If Airbus gets cheaper thanks to those subsidies,
Right.
airlines all over the world might start buying more Airbus planes and fewer Boeings.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
That hurts Boeing's sales, which could mean less production.
Okay, so less production means a hit to the U.S. economy.
Right.
But how does that affect
Yeah.
how much Americans are saving?
Well, anytime you have a change in production,
Okay.
it impacts consumption.
Okay.
So people who lose their jobs might have to dip into their savings.
Okay.
And the overall decline in production is likely to be bigger than the decline in consumption, right?
Okay.
So the national savings rate it takes a hit.
Wow, that's crazy.
Even though the initial problem, started in a completely different country with a totally different product.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's wild.
Yeah.
It reminds me of that global savings glut idea that Ben Bernanke talked about.
Right.
Where too much saving in one part of the world can lead to less saving and more borrowing somewhere else.
Pettis brings it all together really well.
Yeah.
Showing how these policies can have these ripple effects across the globe.
Right.
And there's no better example of this than the European debt crisis.
Yeah, the whole Germany and Spain thing.
Which he dives into.
That's a really clear example of how,
in Chapter 6,
one country's...
It's a classic case.
Success can create problems.
As imbalances playing out, in the real world,
Yeah.
So he explains how Germany's policies... to boost their competitiveness after reunification. Combined with the inflexibility of the euro created this perfect storm. And Germany ended up with these huge trade surpluses.
Yeah.
And so capital was flowing out of the country. And countries like Spain, they were hungry for that capital. So they ended up with these consumption booms, real estate booms. That ultimately led to...
a ton of debt.
A ton of debt, yeah.
So Germany was doing well, but their policies unintentionally contributed.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, right?
To a debt crisis in Spain.
Yeah, that capital flowing out of Germany, right?
Yeah.
Looking for those higher returns. Ended up in Spain, driving up demand, inflating asset prices. And when that bubble burst, Spain was in big trouble. Pettis outlines these 4 options Spain had to adjust. And none of them were good. It was a real lose-lose situation.
Yeah. Talk about being stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
Speaking of tough choices. In Chapter 7, Pettis tackles this question that always seems to be in the headlines. What happens when countries with huge foreign reserves, like China, decide to sell them off? All those U.S. Treasury bonds they're holding.
It creates a lot of fear and speculation.
Yeah, should we be panicking?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
Pettis, he points out that the impact of China selling off those assets depends entirely on what they choose to buy with the money. If they just swap U.S. Treasury bonds for other dollar assets.
So scenario 1, no need to panic.
Yeah, it wouldn't really change much, right? The total amount of dollar savings would stay the same. Trade balances wouldn't be affected.
What about scenario 2?
Now things get more interesting.
Yeah.
What if China decided to diversify its reserves and bought, say, euro bonds instead of U.S. Treasury bonds? Well, then, we might see the euro get stronger and the U.S. dollar weaken. And that could lead to a smaller U.S. trade deficit. But only if European countries don't just turn around and buy those U.S. assets themselves.
It's like a domino effect.
Exactly.
It's not just what China does, but how everyone else reacts. So what's the third scenario?
This one is all about the renminbi. China's currency.
Yeah.
If China reduces its intervention in the currency markets and allows the renminbi to rise, we'd probably see both the Chinese trade surplus and the U.S. trade deficit shrink.
So less meddling, more balance.
Makes sense.
So what's the big takeaway?
The key point here
from all this
is that decisions about these foreign asset holdings, they're not random, They're driven by those same trade dynamics, policy choices that we've been talking about.
Yeah, decisions have consequences. And those consequences can reach across borders.
Absolutely.
This all brings us to a topic I always find fascinating. The idea of the U.S. dollar having this exorbitant privilege. The idea that the U.S. gets all these benefits. Because the dollar is the world's reserve currency.
Yes, the exorbitant privilege. Pettis tackles this head-on in chapters 8 and 9, and he doesn't hold back. He argues it's actually more like an exorbitant burden.
Now I'm really intrigued. Why? a burden and not a privilege.
Well, Pettis explains that those persistent U.S. trade deficits
Right.
are actually a necessary consequence
Okay.
of the dollar being the reserve currency.
Right.
Other countries, they need to accumulate dollars
Right.
to maintain their own trade surpluses, right?
So it's like the U.S. is stuck in this endless cycle of like buying more stuff than it sells just to like keep the global economy or afloat.
Yeah, and he gives some great examples of how countries like Japan and China actually try to resist having their currencies become major reserve currencies.
It's like they're practically begging the U.S.
Yeah, they understand the downsides all too well. Right.
They keep holding on to this so-called privilege.
Yeah.
And what about that whole idea that foreign countries buying U.S. Treasury bonds helps to finance the U.S. government's deficit?
Yeah, that's another myth that Pettis debunks.
Okay.
He explains that those foreign purchases actually fund the current account deficit, not the fiscal deficit. And sometimes they can even lead to higher interest rates in the U.S.
Wait, so those foreign purchases are making it more expensive?
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive,
but the U.S. to borrow money.
It shows that this whole exorbitant privilege thing isn't as simple as it sounds, you know?
It sounds like this privilege is more trouble than it's worth?
Yeah.
But where do we go from here?
That's the big question.
When is this global economic crisis going to end?
Yeah.
And what will things look like?
Yeah, Pettis addresses that.
On the other side.
In the last part of Chapter 9.
Okay.
He says that true resolution requires this rebalancing of those global imbalances.
Okay.
Right? This shift away from these unsustainable patterns of trade and capital flows.
Yeah, there's no easy fix.
But as we've seen, rebalancing can be messy and painful.
So what does Pettis predict will happen?
Yeah, so he outlines different scenarios for various countries.
Okay.
And he stresses there's no, like, one-size-fits-all solution. Right. So he thinks Germany's growth will likely slow down as they adjust to a shrinking trade surplus. The U.S., on the other hand, might see its economy strengthen as its trade deficit narrows, but only if they avoid making the same mistakes they've made in the past. And for China, the transition could be particularly bumpy as they deal with their huge debt and try to shift toward a more consumption-driven economy.
So the message for policymakers is basically good luck.
Pretty much. Pettis emphasizes that they need to understand these incredibly complex dynamics and make choices that minimize the pain, you know? Not just for their own countries, but for the global economy.
Yeah, easier said than done.
As a whole,
Yeah. It sounds like we're in for a gumpy ride.
For sure.
Now, before we wrap things up, we need to touch on one more really interesting idea from Pettis's book. Earlier, we were talking about how China's massive savings rate, like, contributes to their huge trade surplus. Well, Pettis has this appendix at the end of the book that connects income inequality to the savings rates. And it's really interesting.
It's a fascinating connection. He takes us all the way back to the Great Depression. And he quotes Mariner Eccles.
Who was the Fed chairman at the time. And Eccles argued that rising income inequality creates this situation where the rich have more money than they can realistically spend. Well, the poor, you know, they don't have enough to buy all this stuff.
Yeah, so it's like a classic case of, like,
that's being produced.
too much supply.
Exactly.
Not enough demand.
Too much supply, not enough demand.
Yeah. We've all heard that phrase before. But I never really connected it to this issue.
Yeah, it's a really important connection. And Eccles pointed out that this imbalance can lead to a surge in credit. Or even worse, rising unemployment.
Okay, so now we're tying this back to our discussion about trade imbalances. But how does inequality within a country lead to trade imbalances between countries? It seems like they'd be separate issues.
Here's the link. When income inequality is high, overall consumption in a country tends to go down.
And that's because wealthy people, generally speaking, save a larger portion of their income compared to lower income folks. So as more wealth concentrates at the top, less money is actually circulating through the economy, being spent on goods and services.
So if fewer people are buying things, demand weakens. But how does that lead to problems with trade?
Well, when a country's domestic demand is weak,
Okay.
they often look to foreign markets to make up the difference.
Right. So they're like, hey,
They try to export their way out of trouble.
we can't sell all this stuff at home. Let's try to sell it overseas.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's how you get those trade imbalances.
Right.
Countries with high savings and weak demand at home
Right.
end up with those big trade surpluses,
Okay.
while countries with low savings and strong demand
Right.
end up with the trade deficits.
It sounds like a vicious cycle.
It is.
Income inequality leads to weak demand, which leads to trade imbalances, which can then make inequality even worse.
It's a complex web
It's kind of overwhelming to think about.
of interconnected issues, for sure.
Yeah.
But Pettis doesn't just leave us hanging there.
Okay, good.
He lays out what he sees as 3 ways
Okay.
to address this global crisis of demand
Okay.
in a sustainable way.
Okay, what's the first solution?
So he suggests this surge
Okay.
in productive investment,
Okay.
potentially led by governments.
Okay.
The idea is to channel those excess savings into projects
Okay.
that boost productivity, create jobs,
Okay.
which ultimately generates new demand.
That sounds good in theory, but can governments
Yeah.
really be trusted to pick the right investments?
That's a valid concern.
I'm a little skeptical.
And Pettis acknowledges that.
Okay.
But he argues that if the private sector isn't willing to invest,
Right.
governments might need to step in and take the lead.
Okay, so solution 1,
Mm-hmm.
more investment to tackle inequality.
Mm-hmm.
What's the second option?
It's probably not surprising. Reduce income inequality.
Okay.
Pettis argues that policies that promote a more equitable
What?
distribution of income,
Okay.
like progressive taxation, stronger social safety nets,
Okay.
can help to increase consumption.
Right, so basically put more money in the hands of people who will actually spend it.
Exactly.
Okay.
And rebalance the economy.
Boost demand.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But I have a feeling solution number 3 is not going to be as popular.
Unfortunately, you're right.
Okay, what is it?
The third option, and the one that Pettis clearly sees as the least desirable,
Okay.
is to simply accept high levels of unemployment
That's bleak.
for a prolonged period.
So it sounds like our choices are invest more, reduce inequality,
Yeah.
or face the consequences of a stagnant economy
It's a stark reality.
and widespread unemployment.
But it really underscores how important it is to address these imbalances.
Right.
The longer we wait,
Yeah.
the harder it will be to fix them.
Well, there you have it, folks. We journeyed through this fascinating and complex world of global trade imbalances.
Absolutely.
We explored what causes them, what their consequences are,
Uh-huh.
and even brainstormed some possible solutions.
Yeah.
The key takeaway here is that all these issues are interconnected.
They really are.
They affect not just countries and economies, but our everyday lives as well.
Absolutely.
And as we navigate this constantly evolving global landscape,
Yeah.
it's more important than ever to understand these dynamics
Right.
and have informed discussions about how we can build a more
Sure.
sustainable and equitable global economy.
So the next time you hear about a trade dispute or a country's economic woes, think about what we discussed today.
Yeah, it's not
These
bad, but
issues, they're not just abstract concepts.
theoretical, right?
They have real-world consequences
Yeah.
for all of us.
That's a great point to end on. It's been a
Okay.
fascinating deep dive.
Yeah.
And I hope you've all learned as much as I have. Until next time,
Sure.
keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.